Okay, so hello. I'm Rachel Andrew. These days, I'm a technical writer on the Chrome team at Google, creating great resources for developers on web.dev and developer.chrome.com. So as we've heard, 2022, pretty exciting year for CSS. There's a ton of stuff landing in browsers. We've just seen things like Cascade Layers has landed in all 3 browsers. There's loads more happening. And all of this stuff is landing in browsers in a more robust and interoperable way than ever before. Interoperable is really important. Interoperable means that a feature works and works exactly the same across browsers. So you can write CSS and you can use whichever browser you like to write your CSS in, and then you can open up the other browsers, and there it all is, looking exactly the same. Now, in the past, this was something you couldn't rely on. You couldn't rely on this at the most basic of levels, how the width of a box was calculated. Now, when I started doing web development, I started before there was CSS, but when CSS came along, we had a couple of browsers. We had Internet Explorer and we had Netscape, and they calculated the box model differently. So Netscape used the standard box model as we know it today, so that's like if you're using box sizing content box. Internet Explorer used what is now the alternate box model, as if you were using box sizing border box. But there was no box sizing property. So there was no way to normalize the two other than via this box model hack as created by Tarntek Celik. Now, be thankful if you came to web development late enough that you didn't open a browser and realize everything was blown apart because things weren't the size you thought they were going to be. And interoperability, although we didn't tend to use that particular word, was what the Web Standards Project campaigned for back in the day. And I was a WASP member. It's how I kind of got my start working with standards, because I thought this situation of ending up building 2 websites in order for things to look decent in each of the websites was ridiculous. So we pretty much have what the Web Standards Project asked for today. This is huge. So things are better. We don't see enormous bugs like different box models in browsers, and browsers do implement standard features in the same way. The bugs that we find are because browsers are software, and software has bugs. And especially when we're thinking about something like CSS. CSS is really complicated. And then it's written by people who maybe don't really understand CSS very much. Not every web developer really actually knows what they're doing when they're creating CSS. Sometimes they don't really understand what the HTML is supposed to look like, and so the HTML is all broken, and then CSS is trying to render it. CSS also has to render content written in every possible language and script, sometimes in multiple languages and scripts on one page. CSS still needs to allow all of those websites built 20 years ago, and I've still got some that are still online. It still needs to render those and make them look decent. CSS is hard. It's not a simple thing. And the other thing that's happening is that browser versions are being released really quickly. Firefox and Chrome are now on a monthly release cycle. Safari's landing features in more versions each year now as well. Now, if you contrast that to the gap of 5 years between IE 6 and 7, these days I write a monthly post about new things on the web platform, and there's plenty of stuff for me to put in that each month. In fact, I can't put everything in it each month. There's too much. I have to pick the sort of things that I think are most interesting. I can't imagine that happening 10 years ago, when we're sort of sitting around for years waiting for a new browser to show up. So we're getting these features more quickly than ever before. But this kind of leads to a bit of a problem. Every new feature that we get this kind of gap. It lands in one browser, and then there's this gap between it landing in that one browser and us all thinking, yay, we've got this new thing, and before it lands in the rest. Now, contrary to what people on Twitter think, there isn't one browser always in the lead. You find that it's spread out pretty well across all the browsers who lands a feature first. But this is a problem for developers. Every survey we do, we hear this. This is from the State of CSS survey, browser compatibility, top of the list. Same sort of responses in the MDN developer needs assessment, interoperability across browsers, top of the list. And this is some research conducted at Google. Again, making a designer experience work the same across browsers, that's a top challenge. Now, everyone who wants to work on a browser or engine, they all want to make the browser better, and they want to make the web better. Everyone wants to do that for developers. No one's trying to make things worse for developers. But if everyone picks a different feature to work on, we could actually make this gap worse. We could make this sort of fragmentation of browser support even worse. It's not helpful if one browser lands container queries, another one has subgrid, and a third fixes all of the really gnarly Flexbox bugs. We want to have all of these things everywhere so we can feel confident in using them. And so it's this gap that the Interop 2022 project is aiming to help reduce. It's an effort to improve the experience of developing for the web in 15 key areas. And you can follow along on the dashboard. And we're well through the year at the moment. So the dashboard's looking pretty good. This is the scores for Chrome Dev, Firefox Nightly, and Safari Technology Preview, so the experimental browsers. If you go to the dashboard there, you can toggle and look and see what has actually shipped. And again, if you look at this breakdown of current scores, it really highlights this fragmentation of support between browsers. We've not got one browser that's far behind the others. Each has got better scores in different areas. So before looking at some of the included features, I wanted to talk a bit about how we get to these scores. Where do they come from? How do we calculate them? So the scores are based on passing web platform tests. We've got this test suite for the web platform, and so we can test and see how well browsers are doing on these features. So if you click on any of those areas in the table, you get a list of the available tests, and they'll thoroughly test the feature. And you can see at the top of the table there which browser versions are being used. On the left, the actual tests that are being run, and you can click on any of those and see a bit more detail, and you can actually go and view the source of the individual test. While we're here, many CSS tests are as simple as this one. It's a very simple reference test to see if current color is being correctly inherited. There's lots of missing tests for CSS specs. So if you've ever fancied getting involved in improving the web platform, helping to write tests, that's a really good way to start. So that's how we're assessing the features. So let's have a quick look at which features are being included. So there's a bunch of features that came from the previous year's version of this project. That was Compact 2021. And now that did some really great work in improving the scores for a number of features. And this is the bunch of features that were included. We've got aspect ratio, flexbox, grid, sticky positioning, and transforms. These are various little bits and pieces that needed fixing. And there's a few bits left over. You can see the scores are pretty high for these. There's a few bits left over, and so they've been included in this project in order to get those kind of finished off. So then we've got some new features that were chosen for Interop 2022. And here's the list and the current standings of earlier this week. So we're well through the year. So many of these are close to 100%. We're doing quite well. I think cascade layers is probably the big feature that's been included. Now, they're supported in all of the browsers now and all of the main engines, so all the scores are over 95%. The cascade has been something that developers have long struggled with, and cascade layers just gives us this way to manage that. It's definitely the sort of feature you can't use until it's everywhere. It's pretty fundamental if you're sort of dealing with a cascade. So that's really exciting that that's been included. So you can now group your styles into a layer and manage how that entire layer fits into the cascade. Really elegant solution, very, very useful if you're working with things like frameworks and so on that have got a whole bunch of CSS, and then you want to add some of your own CSS. You can kind of isolate it, and hopefully you'll get away from having style sheets that are full of important and so on to try and overwrite things. Color spaces and functions. There's some really cool stuff within this section. Now, if you recognize the box model hack that I showed earlier, you might also remember when we only had 216 colors to play with on the web, because those are the ones that displayed properly across browsers. Things aren't that bad now, but we have been tied to sRGB. This is changing, and we're getting new color spaces such as lab, and these sort of color spaces are part of the project. And we also have these new color functions. We've been using color functions. If you use a preprocessor like SAS, a lot of people use these things in order to change colors. Things like make a color lighter is a very common thing to do. And so these color functions will let us do this in CSS. We can do it dynamically. Color mix takes two colors, returns the result of mixing them in a specified color space by a specified amount. So here I'm mixing increasing amounts of white in the LCH color space. So that's just going to be really useful. Looking forward to having that in all of our browsers. Containment with the contain property, that was mentioned in Miriam's talk. It's not container queries that's part of interop, but it's just the contain property, basically, making sure that that's working really well. Containment is actually very useful if you're building a site where you're changing things dynamically with JavaScript, and sort of you might get some layout shifts because of that. If you know how big things are, if you know certain things about something, you know it's not going to be touched by the stuff outside, you can use the contain property to basically give the browser a hint that it doesn't need to go and figure all that stuff out again if things on the page change. But they're also a foundational step for enabling container queries. We've then got the dialogue element. This gives us a way to create the kind of modal dialogues that web apps tend to need. It comes with the JavaScript API for opening and closing dialogues, and the backdrop pseudo class for styling the backdrop behind the dialogue. This has got pretty good browser support already. Browsers are doing well, they've got scores in the 90s. The final work as part of Interop 2022 is just to tidy up some of those outstanding issues. This is a real key UI component, so it's great if it's going to be rock solid. My colleague Adam Argyle at Google has got a really nice tutorial on web.dev sharing how to build on top of this element. So that's really worth looking at. And then forms. This is one of the issues that contains within it a whole bunch of small tests to fix things with forms that you might run into as a developer. It's not fix everything that's terrible about forms, but it's kind of fix, here's a pile of small issues that make forms hard, and let's try and make them better. So if you want to find out what's included, poke around in the web platform tests, and you can see what's actually included for forms there. You can also read the long thread discussing which features were included here. And all of these features were discussed and agreed by representatives of all the browsers and some other parties, such as Igalia. So to sort of have this discussion about what it was that would be good to have in the project and what actually could be fixed. And then the scrolling. There's a ton of issues that relate to scrolling on the web. Scrolling is quite hard. And these things came up. There was a survey that some of my colleagues created, the Scroll Survey, and then they created a report to explain what they found. So you can have a look at those things. And so Interop 2022 aims to fix some of the issues around overscroll behavior and scroll snapping. And now we come to a cause that is dear to my heart. I've been waiting for this for a very long time, and that is Subgrid. Very much long awaited by me. It's already in Firefox, it landed in Safari a day or so ago, and it's also under development in Chrome with work being undertaken by the Microsoft team. It allows you to inherit the number and sizes of tracks into nested grids, and it unlocks a whole bunch of layout patterns that I'm really excited about, and I'm sure plenty more that I haven't thought of yet. So I'm really looking forward to getting that across browser. Then we've got typography and encodings. This includes tests that are mostly around typography fixes for CJK, so Chinese, Japanese, and Korean characters. For example, the IC unit, which represents the advanced measure, where the CH unit represents the advanced measure of the 0 character in the font used to render it. The IC unit represents the advanced measure of the CJK water ideograph, which enables measurements based on an expected glyph count. Now, the things in this section might be less useful to Western audiences, but it's great to see all these improvements for things that make the web truly international. And then viewport units. Developers have a lot of trouble with viewport sizing, particularly on mobile devices where you have different placements of elements like the address bar. So we've got some different units there that kind of to help with that sort of sizing. And so these units are in values and units level 4, and they describe things like the largest and smallest dynamic viewport sizes, and they're included in this project too. And then finally, we have the web compat section. Now, these round up a few issues that have caused site compatibility problems. So this is where a site or users of a site have reported issues that are caused by differences in browsers. Now, you might also have spotted there on the chart, there are 3 areas listed under investigation. Now, this includes editing with content editable, pointer and mouse events, and viewport measurement. Now, the reason these are investigations rather than being able to sort of fix them and have proper scores for them is because we know these things are causing problems, but the state of the specifications or the existing tests just isn't good enough for us to be at a point where we can really do a meaningful score. So the idea of these investigations is it's a chance for everyone to have a look at that, the different browser engines and other people, have a look, see if we can get them to a point where perhaps they've got a good enough spec and tests, and then move them on to actually solving these problems. So I feel like this work is so important. You know, it's so important to see this happening with representatives from all of the different browser engines, and this sort of, you know, we're trying to make the web here better for developers, removing issues. You know, every single issue we remove is something less to trip you up and cause you a problem. And also you're getting valuable new features, you know, landing in browsers more quickly, and that's also really exciting. We don't have this sort of big gap where people are looking forlornly at a shiny feature and realizing they can't use it because it's not available everywhere. And given we're in September, you might be thinking, well, are we going to carry on? And yes, we are. In fact, this week, we're going to be announcing the proposal process. So you can actually propose features for Interop 2023. There's some information on the site as to what's going to make a good proposal. So you can submit your ideas, and we can look forward to another year of working together to make the web more interoperable. And if you're attending the rest of TPAC, there's a breakout session tomorrow about Interop 2023. So if this has been interesting, come along to the breakout session to learn a bit more. So I hope you find this stuff exciting and interesting, and I think, you know, if you are building for the web, you know, this is making the web measurably better, which is really cool. I think, you know, fewer bugs, fewer problems, and we can all sort of make a better web together. So thanks very much for listening.